Welcome. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Kim Porter. I'm the Executive Director of Be a Part of the Conversation. Tonight, our host is the Bucks County Drug and Alcohol Commission. Thank you very much to Bucks County. We've been really happy to partner with them for many years now. And we do have Mallory Parati on the line with us in case there are any questions specifically for Bucks County. So thanks, Mallory. I wanted to introduce you to Judy Hirsch, who is our Director of Community Engagement.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
Judy's gonna be helping me out with any questions that come in. So please feel free as we go throughout the evening to submit questions using the chat feature or the Q&A box. We did receive some advanced questions as well. So thank you for anyone who submitted those. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. We are recording this program. We had a lot of requests. I think that tonight had a lot of conflicts for some reason because had sort of an unusual number of people who asked about recording. So I just want to let you know as attendees that your names will not be visible in the recording. Any questions you ask will not be visible. You're going to remain private. Only the panelists will be seen in this recording. We have a survey that will pop up at the end of the program, and as your screen ends the program, you'll see an opportunity to go through to a survey. We really love to hear from you as far as, was this helpful to you? What would you like to hear more from us in the future? Any topics that you have in mind, any feedback at all? We're very, very interested in hearing from you. Even if you've participated in the past, we really appreciate you taking the time to do that. You can follow up on tonight's topic by visiting our website, conversation.zone/stimulants. In fact, my PowerPoint and Dr. Hobelman's PowerPoint are both available right now, but stay with us because this is much better to hear it live so that you can ask questions and get responses on the spot. We want to remind you that we have these really amazing current support groups taking place throughout the region. And when I say region, I mean pretty much virtually. Some of them are in person, but most of them right now are on Zoom. We just recently expanded these meetings to include quite a few. This is just it's hard to see, I know, but it's on our website, conversation.zone/partnership calendar, shows you all these different meetings that are happening. The green buttons are on Zoom, the purple buttons are in person, and the red ones are hybrid. But each of these you can click on and find out how to get the link for the Zoom meetings, what the topics might be, who to contact for further information, and all of that. We parents, and I'm a parent of someone in recovery, we really need to connect with one another to keep ourselves connected and on track, in our own pathways to recovery. Wanted to mention just a couple of things we have coming up. Tomorrow night and Thursday night, we have 2 creative recovery programs. Tomorrow we'll be doing some creative writing, and on Thursday we will have a music workshop. So these are both opportunities to enhance recovery, deepen recovery, and this could be for anyone who is in recovery from a substance use disorder, but also, again, for we family members. We are all on a journey, and we want to kind of find ways to really celebrate that journey in recovery. So check out that section of our website, conversation.zone/creative, to get more information. On October 5th, we have a program called Out of Isolation and Into Recovery. We'll be partnering with Montgomery County for this one. We'll be talking with folks who can help us with understanding ways that we can access treatment, find an assessment for treatment, perhaps get some county funding for treatment. But it's been such a tough time this past year and a half, obviously, for everyone, but particularly for our community of folks who are struggling with substance use. So we hope to help folks find a way out of isolation and into recovery. One of our favorite topics is cannabis these days because there's so much confusion, and we are going to do our best to help dispel some myths, share some really important information, particularly about young people. This is part of our Youth Marijuana Prevention Project. October 12th, we'll have some terrific speakers with us that evening and hope that you'll join us. These programs and more can be found on our calendar. Judy's going to be sharing this link and some of these others in the chat, so you can check that out as we go through the program. So on to our subject matter tonight, stimulants. Just one quick note about some of the things, at least that I'll be sharing. The data that's been collected during this pandemic, in the year 2020 in particular, that's the most recent full year of data that we might have in any of this research that you'll see. Most of these studies are making a point, National Institute on Drug Abuse and others, that 2020 was a challenging year for collecting data. So I just like to make that little disclaimer. I want to start by sort of just highlighting what are stimulants exactly. They can be prescribed stimulants. Some of these are the more common ones that you certainly, most of us have heard of Adderall and Ritalin. These are prescribed for things like ADHD and sometimes sleep disorders. Then there are some illicit stimulant drugs, such as methamphetamine, comes in various forms and is consumed in various ways. Amphetamines can be powder, tablets, or liquid, orally injected or smoked. Cocaine might be a powder form that is snorted. It can also be in the freebase form of crack cocaine that is smokable. And just taking a look at monitoring the future is a study that's done every year among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, looking for trends, looking for that same cohort of students as they're going throughout their maturation. And you can see that over time, the 12th grade use of Adderall, for example, has been somewhat decreasing, picked up a bit in 2020. Pretty level, kind of coming down a bit for 10th grade. But if you take a look at those blue bars, which show 8th graders, there's some real concern here with 8th grade use. For some reason, that age group is really picking up the consumption of, or misuse of Adderall, perhaps. So in fact, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, again, felt that this was important enough that they drilled down on these substances, cough medicine, amphetamine, and inhalants among 8th graders in particular has really escalated over the last, this is showing the last 5 years. So just want to bring that to everyone's attention that there's some concern here. These are all substances that might be, well, cough medicine and Adderall might be something that is prescribed or recommended by a physician, but it also is has the potential for misuse. So we want to be very cautious about these different substances. So this is some self-reporting on a national survey on drug use and health. And this does not include 2020, but just taking a look at 2016 through 19, breaking down in age groups of 12 to 17, 18 to 25, and then 26 years old and older. Now, this is taking a look at cocaine use, and very clearly the greatest amount of use is among those 18 to 25-year-olds. Now looking at methamphetamine use, a bit more in the 12 to 17-year-old, but you can see how it's really escalating among 26-year-olds and older. And then taking a look at prescription stimulants, you can see that we have a pretty precipitous drop in 2019 among the 18 to 25-year-old population, which is very good news. So maybe some of this messaging is getting out there and there are some movements in the right direction. And by the way, this is misuse of prescription stimulants. I don't think any of us have missed this unfortunate news that came out this summer. 2020 saw an incredibly unfortunate spike in overdose deaths. We know that approximately 93,000 Americans died in 2020 from a drug overdose. And of those 93,000, about 60% of them involved fentanyl. Fentanyl is, in this case, a synthetic opioid. It can be prescribed, but in these cases, it is illicit. It is something that is found in toxicology reports. I think this gives a pretty good snapshot of the last roughly 20 years, seeing these three waves that have happened. A lot of us have heard about whether it's, a lot of the news reporting on Purdue Pharma and the rather egregious marketing that was done over the years to prescribers, which translated to a lot of prescriptions being written for opioids. And then we saw an uptick in heroin use, which wasn't too surprising, unfortunately, because once people are addicted to a prescribed opioid, they might move on to heroin to continue that use. And then once prescribing was reined in, people were already addicted. And so heroin use really picked up again. And then this third wave is really pointing to that fentanyl, the synthetic opioids that are becoming really, and unfortunately, a part of so many toxicology reports, including polysubstance use. So again, focusing on stimulants. We're looking here at national data on overdose deaths through from 2010 to 2019. Red bars are methamphetamine, and the blue bars are cocaine related deaths due to overdose. And you can see that the cocaine deaths have risen, but the methamphetamine is really picking up. Unfortunately, this study didn't compare 2020 yet, so we do know though that some reports are showing that there was a really huge spike in 2020, also of methamphetamine use. JAMA just published an article about this, in fact, and I have that information on that follow-up page, by the way. And here we have taking a look at toxicology screens for this is from the tracking data in drug use. So these would be law enforcement, things like that are looking at urine screens. So you can see that methamphetamine really has been escalating over the years, along with that there's that spike in fentanyl. And you can see that dotted line showing where COVID-19 came into our lives that really did change some trajectories on a lot of substance use. Again, all of this PowerPoint is on our website, so I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on these, just want to bring them to your attention. Oops, sorry. And this is another trend looking at, again, you can see methamphetamine use picking up, and in this case, cocaine use coming down over time, along with cannabis use coming down a bit. And again, there's that dotted line where we know that COVID came into our lives. Since we're talking about hoping to have some folks with us tonight from Bucks County, just wanted to give you a little bit of information that Mallory graciously shared with us. This past fiscal year, a little over 1,000 individuals received county funding for treatment. Of those individuals, 13% or so of them received that treatment and used a combination of stimulants and opioids. 122% of individuals' primary substance of use was methamphetamine. 94% of their secondary substance use was methamphetamine. So obviously a big challenge for a lot of folks in our region. So that is all that I have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce you to Dr. Greg Hobelman. And Dr. Hobelman, if you wouldn't mind, rather than me reading your bio, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself, and we're just so grateful to have you with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. So thanks for having me. So yeah, my name is Greg Hobelman. I work at Ashley Addiction Treatment. I'm currently the co-CEO there. And by my background, I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I actually started my career in anesthesiology and pain management. And then I had an addiction, went to 2 treatment programs, and sort of had to rebuild my life afterwards, which I did starting in 2011. And that's when I went back to get a master's of public health and then be retrained in psychiatry. And I've been at Ashley since 2016. So I'm really focusing on the population that's very dear to my heart, which is those with substance use disorder. So tonight, as noted, we're talking about stimulants, and I love the most up-to-date statistics that you have, Kim. I really appreciate it, because I'm going to be talking more about some trends rather than actually going over most recent statistics. There we go. Trying to figure out how to do it. So when we look at just the chronology of stimulant misuse over time, this is very rough, but it gives you an idea of when certain stimulants were popular. So in the 80s, we saw a big bump in the use of cocaine. In the 90s, ecstasy or MDMA came on the scene, and we started to see really an increase in the use of prescription medications, the medications that you noted, primarily Adderall and Ritalin, or methylphenidate and amphetamine. In the 2000s, there was a significant increase in the use of methamphetamine. And then in 2010s, it kind of, there's a lot of different now designer drugs and so forth. And the bath salts were an early stimulant. They're not very popular anymore, but they were sold over the counter. And just to note, something that everyone should be aware of is that on the dark web, people are able to get a variety of different compounds now that are stimulant-like. They have interesting names with letters and numbers, but we don't really know exactly what they are, or what, you don't know what you're buying, you don't know the potency of it. So it's something to be very aware of. The reason that people use stimulants, and there are a couple of very good reasons, and the most significant is because it enhances mood and causes euphoria. So it feels good, and that's a common thing among all substances of abuse, is that they cause a mood change, which is understandable for why people use them, but it's very much a desired effect. It also increases attention and alertness. And something to note here is that it increases attention and alertness for everyone. They are can be incredibly effective for those with suffering from ADHD, with true diagnosed ADHD. They can be really life changers, but you have to be very careful in the diagnosis of it. And because they work for everyone, sometimes somebody who actually does not have ADHD may think that these medications are effective because they're, again, effective for everybody. You have a decreased need for sleep. They can cause appetite suppression and sexual arousal. The things that we really don't like to see, and the true adverse effects, one is psychosis. So someone who's using a stimulant for a prolonged period. This is most significant with methamphetamine, but also certainly possible with cocaine. We see it quite frequently with cocaine, actually. Bath salts caused a lot of psychosis, and even amphetamine can do it. And we see various cardiovascular effects. So it increases your heart rate, causes arrhythmias, can cause heart attacks and sudden death, hypertension and stroke. It can cause an increase in your temperature and a death of muscle cells. And ultimately, it can lead to multi-system organ failure. And so people who have an overdose, so to speak, of stimulants die typically from multi-system organ failure. In terms of tolerance, so with other substances such as opioids, alcohol, and sedatives like benzodiazepines, you have a tolerance, which means that you need a higher dose over time to have the same effect. So you end up increasing a dose over time. There's no true tolerance with stimulants, but what we do see is what's called an acute tachyphylaxis, which means that during a period of use, so if someone was to use a stimulant repeatedly over the same night, they will see a decreasing effect, particularly with the euphoria and sexual arousal will decrease during that one period, as well as the cardiovascular effects. What this means is that you will end up not having the same amount of euphoria when used in a one period of time. But if you're to use again the next day or 2 days later, you're not going to have tolerance to the substance. And you also build a tolerance to the anorexia or decrease in appetite suppression. And then you see a sensitization, which means that certain things become worse with use over time. And these are the kind of dangerous things that we're really concerned about. One is it ultimately will decrease seizure threshold. So somebody who ends up having a seizure, if they have a seizure disorder, or if they have a seizure that's been caused by a stimulant, they're more likely to have another seizure. And that's the same thing with the psychosis. And what we're talking about with psychosis are things like delusions, hallucinations, and then just disorganized thinking. And we tend to see paranoid delusions in people who are using stimulants, but it looks very much like schizophrenia. So in the emergency room, when somebody comes in acutely psychotic, we're always watching. We always do a toxicology to make sure that they're not using substances. And it's not just stimulants that can cause psychosis. Cannabis can also do it, as well as some other substances. But we want to make sure that they're no longer intoxicated before we make any sort of diagnosis. But we see it quite frequently. And then some stereotypical behaviors, things like checking repeatedly, hoarding, and things like that. Withdrawal, it's not as pronounced, so to speak, as you see from somebody who abruptly stops using opioids or even alcohol or sedatives, which can be very dangerous. But there's absolutely a withdrawal syndrome, and it can be very miserable. We tend to see things like anhedonia and depressed mood. Anhedonia is the inability to really experience pleasure, increased appetite, general decrease in energy and fatigue. We can have vivid dreams, and it really interferes with all sleep cycles. So sometimes you see insomnia, sometimes you see hypersomnia. But this is very unpleasant, and people tend to be very irritable. They have a lot of mood lability, and it lasts for about 5 to 8 days, that acute period. And then the post-acute period, post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which is very similar to the post-acute withdrawal syndrome we see for other substances, can last for many months, sometimes up to 2 years. And this is just a little bit about an important piece I like to, this addresses all substances of abuse, and this describes very briefly and at a very simple level what occurs in someone's brain when they become addicted. And I put this in here so that people really do have an understanding, because what happens is that people in active addiction look very different than they do when they're not in active addiction. And it doesn't really matter the substance, but their behavior changes. They lose control of their ability to use a substance and control their behavior in other ways as well. So why does that occur? So if we take a look at our brain and we divide it into 3 components, you have the neocortex, and mostly the frontal cortex, and that is the part of your brain that's responsible for your thinking, the rational behavior, the planning, the executing, and so forth. Then we have the limbic system, which is responsible for the emotion and feeling. And then we have what we call the reptilian brain, the lower base part of our brain. And this part of our brain is responsible for survival. It's not a conscious part of our brain. But when we think about the drive to survive, this part of our brain is telling us we need food, water, sex, and child rearing to some degree. And if we can get those 4 things, we'll be able to live, and we'll be able to continue our species. And the drive to get those things is incredibly powerful. And we call it the reptilian brain because we as humans, of course, have the most complicated brains that we know of. But the reptilian brain, a lot of organisms have a much simpler brain, and reptiles have essentially only that reptilian brain. So they don't have a part of their brain that thinks. They don't really have an emotional piece. And you can imagine that, an alligator, been around for a long time, incredibly successful as a species. They are driven to eat, drink, and procreate, lay eggs and take care of their offspring to some degree or less. Incredibly successful, and they do it without any emotion or any thinking, but they are driven for those things. And the same occurs if we look over human history. If we are unable to obtain food and water, we've had wars over that. We kill for those reasons. So the drive to get these things is incredibly powerful. Now, what happens when we continuously add a mind or mood altering drug to our brain? Well, it turns out a lot of the part of our brain that's affected is that reptilian brain. And in that reptilian brain, if we continue to add a substance, the changes that occur over time, your reptilian brain thinks that you need that drug of choice to survive. And then over time, your drug of choice kind of climbs the ladder. And now subconsciously, that reptilian brain is telling us we have to have that drug of choice to survive. And it makes a lot of sense. But if you think about it, somebody who has whether it's a stimulant addiction, an opioid addiction, an alcohol addiction, the first thing they think about when they wake up is how to get that substance. And that reptilian brain is sending signals to your limbic brain and to your neocortex to change the way you feel and change the way you think. That's the idea of the hijacked brain, to drive your thinking and emotions to getting that substance. And so hence, we really do lose control of our ability to make choices that we normally would. To some extent, our character is ripped away. Now, when we look at the mechanism of action of cocaine, it works on dopamine. So you see on the left here, we have, and this is one cell and another cell. And this is incredibly complicated in your brain. We have and beautifully regulated. Dopamine is just one of many of the chemicals that are acting in our brain to create your biological activity. But dopamine is really important for substance use disorders. So here, what happens is you see this cell wants to talk to this cell over here. It releases dopamine, it attaches to a receptor, causes a biological activity. Once it's released from that receptor, it goes through a process of reuptake where then it's broken down in this cell. And what cocaine does is cocaine simply blocks that reuptake transporter. So that cell can, the first cell, the presynaptic cell, can no longer reuptake the dopamine, which leaves a lot more dopamine in that cleft. And that increased level of dopamine is what is responsible for why we desire a substance and why that substance feels good to us. Now, with methamphetamine, it takes it another level. So not only are you blocking the reuptake transporter, but you're actually reversing it. So you cause an extra release, which just causes a much greater amount of dopamine in the cleft or the synapse. And the exact mechanism, isn't really important, but the idea of this increase in dopamine really is important, because the reward system works in large part on dopamine. It's not simply dopamine, but it plays a large role. And so when we look at either behaviors or substances that tend to feel good and tend to make us want to do them again, they have an increase in dopamine. So when you think about sweet food, it's about 150% of your dopamine level. Sex, morphine, alcohol, about 200%, nicotine, 225%, and cocaine is up to 300%. When we're talking about crystal meth, it's greater than 1,000%. And so the impact and the addictive nature of that drug and how it affects the ability to recover from it really is different with methamphetamine. So as I noted, that dopamine system, it starts here in that reptilian brain. And when your reptilian brain says, I need to have this substance to survive, it then sends those signals out to that limbic system to drive the emotions and the cortex to drive your actions to get that substance. And I think, when you overall understand that very simple, basic premise, it helps us to have empathy for those suffering from substance use disorders. And it helps to explain why they're behaving the way they do, why they have that sense of loss of control. And then if we look at brain activity, what we're looking here is a functional image, which means that when this person was having the CAT scan, they were asked to do a memory task, a thinking task, and the brain lights up because of glucose uptake. But we see here in a normal subject, the red is where it's really active, the yellow is where it's quite active. And when asked to do a memory task, their brain lights up quite a bit. And somebody suffering with a cocaine addiction, when asked to do a memory task, you see very little bit lighting up. In particular, what you see that's not lighting up is that frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is the part that's responsible for planning and acting. And that's the part of your brain that says, hey, this isn't a good idea, or maybe I shouldn't do it. So not only is the reptilian brain saying, I need this, the part of your brain that says, maybe it's not a good idea is not functioning. So the defense system is really down. Now, the good thing is that this does reverse over time. And you can see down here at 100 days, there's quite a bit more activity. And if you look out to a year, 2 years, it's going to look very similar to this normal subject. So talking about the history of prescribed stimulant misuse and use in general. So in 1937, it was discovered that stimulants were very useful for the treatment of ADHD. ADHD wasn't very well defined at the time, but we understood there's something going on in certain people that have attention and hyperactivity issues. And if they're treated with stimulants, some of them improve dramatically. We didn't see a big increase in the prescriptions until the 1960s. And even in the 1960s, we didn't see a large amount of prescriptions, but it really became part of standard practice for somebody who is diagnosed with ADHD to have stimulants as part of the treatment program potentially. By 1987, the use amongst all youth across the board was about 0.6%. And by 2002, that number had increased almost fivefold to 2.9%. So it may not seem like a large number, but if you look at that rate of increase, it's pretty significant. In 2013, by 2013, the misuse was recognized as a very serious problem. And currently, if you look at the data across college campuses, it is estimated that the prevalence of misuse is between 13 and 23%, sometimes estimated as high as 43%, which means that 43% of people on a college campus potentially have tried stimulants that weren't prescribed to them. So this is the production actually of just from DEA data, the production of amphetamine and methylphenidate. And as you can see, methylphenidate's in purple and amphetamine is in gray. And this doesn't get really up to current at all, but you can see a trend, and that's what I want to show. And if you look in 1990 versus 2000, it's vastly different in just terms of the pure production. We initially saw a huge increase in methylphenidate. That was more of the choice of the medication used to treat people in the 90s and early 2000s, and amphetamine became more popular in the mid 90s. And this shows just total number of prescriptions. The lines show methylphenidate and amphetamine, but really taking a look just at the total numbers. And this is between 91 and 2010. And you can just see this is in millions. So you only had 4 million prescriptions. It's a decent amount in 1991, but you can look just till 2010 and see the huge increase in number of prescriptions. And that number is continuing to increase. And where are people getting the stimulants that are not prescribed? So if you look at people between 18 and 28 years old who are misusing stimulants, you ask them where they're getting them. The majority of people are getting them from their friends. So the vast majority are asking a friend who has been prescribed. And you do see, very few are getting it from a drug dealer. A classmate could be potentially a friend, and some from family. But most of them were getting them from a friend who has been prescribed it. And of course, a lot of people are being prescribed it, going in and manipulating their provider, so to speak, which is quite easy to do. So switching over to methamphetamine. Methamphetamine has been around for a long time. It was first developed in Japan in 1919 and actually was used by both sides in World War II for soldiers, particularly for airmen, to keep them awake so that they could continue to fight in the war. In 1950s, it was prescribed primarily as a diet aid and occasionally as a pick-me-up. And you may have heard of Benzedrine, what they called bennies, which were the uppers, and so they were used occasionally as sort of the upper pills at the time. But the abuse didn't really increase until the 60s, and that's when it became available for intravenous use. And with that, we saw a huge increase in abuse. In the 1970s, it was the motorcycle gangs who controlled much of the production and the distribution, and it was called crank because they used to store it and transport it in their crankcases of the motorcycles. And again, it was a relatively small population that was using at the time. And by the way, this picture down here on the bottom is actually a picture of the pills that were used during the war. It's called Pervitin. In the 90s, we saw a rise in the primitive meth labs. These were the labs where people were going to the pharmacies, and you could use all over-the-counter materials, and you could make methamphetamine. That's why we have Sudafed or pseudoephedrine behind the counter now, because that was a common ingredient. People used to buy huge amounts of it to be used in this kind of lab. had very small yield overall. And you might remember that there were a lot of accidents, a lot of these labs blowing up and catching on fire, and a lot of injuries associated with it. Today, what we have is mega labs. They're not really in this country, most of which are in Mexico, but they're making hundreds of pounds of pure meth at a time. So even if you look at Walter White, what he was doing in Breaking Bad, it doesn't come close to what's happening right now, again, primarily in Mexico with these mega labs. And a key point is with both of these, with prescription stimulants as well as methamphetamine, when you increase access, you are going to increase the amount of people with substance use disorders and the comorbidities associated with it. So we are going to see an increase in overdose deaths. And Kim, you put some information on a slide before, and yeah, you've seen an increase in overdose deaths from stimulants, a pretty dramatic increase. So if you go back to 2000, there were less than 1,000 deaths associated with cocaine and amphetamine. And in, I think, 2019, there were close to 17,000 deaths associated with stimulants. Now, what you'll see is that with methamphetamine, actually, the deaths, whether or not they are mixed with an opioid, you see an increase in deaths. But with cocaine, what you've seen is a huge increase in deaths in cocaine that has been mixed with fentanyl. And cocaine itself has not seen a huge rise in overdose deaths. But when mixed with fentanyl, and they're mixing it with fentanyl to create more customers. So when you look at just some general characteristics of those who misuse, about 47% of methamphetamine users reported using prescription stimulants as well. So the question is whether or not people who are using prescription stimulants then go on to use methamphetamine. And it does not seem to be related, but people who have used methamphetamine, half of them have used prescription stimulants at some point. It turns out the prescription stimulant misuse occurs earlier in life than we see in people who are using methamphetamine for the first time. And it makes sense because that's a population where it's prescribed and it's available. Multi-drug use is common in both. So when somebody who's using stimulants across the board, you're going to see use of other substances, whether it's alcohol, cannabis, opioids, very, very common. Males are more likely to misuse methamphetamine, and those who use methamphetamine typically report more substance abuse in general, mental health problems, and deviant behaviors. And the question there is whether or not that is due to the methamphetamine, and that's what it appears to be. It appears to be that those who use the substance end up with more of these negative behaviors. And again, methamphetamine is almost in a class of its own with regard to potency, addictive potential, and then difficulty with recovery. Challenges that we have with regard to treating this, there are numerous. I'll just point out a couple. One really important one is that there are no FDA-approved medications for the treatment of stimulant dependence. We have medications that are FDA approved for the treatment of opioid use disorder, both as a treatment to block the effects of opioids, as well as to mimic, so to speak, the effect of opioids, and that have been shown to be incredibly effective. And we have several drugs that are utilized for the treatment of alcohol use disorder, but there are no FDA-approved medications. There are medications that have been tried. There are several of them, and occasionally people will prescribe them, but it's fairly rare. And it's because those medications all have their own set of side effects, but they just have not been shown to really decrease craving, maintain abstinence for longer periods of time or anything like that. So unfortunately, we don't have medications. There's also no particular antidote for stimulant intoxication. For an opioid overdose, we have naloxone that can reverse quickly. We have the same thing for sedative. We don't really have it for alcohol either, but we have to just use supportive treatment. So when somebody comes in and they're psychotic, we can give some medications to help with the psychosis a little bit. When someone comes in with these difficult cardiovascular effects, we really only have supportive treatment. And then as noted, we are seeing these stimulant-induced deaths increasing, largely due to fentanyl co-administration. Now, it's not only because of fentanyl co-administration with cocaine. With methamphetamine. Methamphetamine itself is causing more overdose deaths, but with cocaine in particular, and with other stimulants, and they have the pressed pills. So if they're creating pressed pills that look like Adderall or look like Ritalin, which they're creating now, they're mixing that with fentanyl, and we're seeing a larger amount of overdose associated with that. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Tom.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hobelman. It is great to be here. Kim, thank you so much for the invitation. Hello, everybody. My name is Tom McDermott. I'm the Regional Resource Director at Caron Treatment Centers in Wernersville, Pennsylvania. And I'm here to talk about my journey into meth and my journey into recovery after meth and what I'm seeing now working in the field. So, so I won't go into the details of my story because I only have 20 minutes. We could be here for 3 hours if I give you the full story. So we'll get the short version. But anyway, I grew up in a small town in West Virginia is where I grew up. I was born outside of Washington, and when I was about 4, we moved to West Virginia. Parents, brother, and sister. And moving to remote West Virginia as a little kid, I just felt like I never fit in. I never felt part of. Never felt comfortable in my own skin. And that was kind of the start of my mantra going through life. Never felt like I was part of or fitting in, and kind of felt like the odd man out. And, in elementary school, going into middle school, I was really teased, picked on. I was a little bit different. I didn't like sports. I liked to play with dolls, and I liked to jump rope and whatnot. And, that didn't really go well with the kids at school. I'm grateful that my family allowed me to be me, right? So even back in the 70s, my mom and dad were like, look, if you want to play with dolls and tap dance and twirl around in a skirt, we really don't care. Just have fun. And trust me, I did twirl around in the skirt because I thought I was Linda Carter on Wonder Woman, but that's that's a conversation for another day. But I didn't realize how much being teased and picked on impacted me, and it fed into that misbelief that you're not good enough, and that you don't fit in. And at that, going into high school, I was really questioning my sexuality. I really didn't know what gay was. All I kind of knew was that I wasn't really interested in girls except for what they were wearing and their makeup and their hair. That's about it. I was more interested in boys. And, as I was coming into my sexuality and questioning, it was the early 80s, which is when the AIDS epidemic hit full swing. And initially, for those that remember, that it initially hit the gay community. So what I was seeing as a kid on television was it was a gay disease, and it was God's way of punishing gay people, and that this was going to wipe them out. And then some people would even say it was a good thing. And we didn't have social media. It was the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news, and whatever was in newspaper and magazines. So the message I was receiving was, it's not okay to be yourself. Again, you don't fit in, and it was a bad thing. So that was my evolution into my sexuality. And so I finished high school, didn't want to go to college, got a job, but I was curious and wanted to explore and see what was out there. So a friend of mine from work took me to my very first gay bar in Washington, D.C. And back then, most of the gay bars in Washington were in like the worst part of town. And, we would park the car and literally run into the clubs. And I remember walking into my very first gay bar. It was in a really rough part of town. We walk in, paid our admission, and like there was, dance music playing in the background. I think Madonna was playing in the background. They were, men barely wearing anything, dancing on the bars, and there were just gay people everywhere. And I thought in my mind, this is what the gay world is all about. And I started drinking. I drank at that time, and I drank alcoholically and didn't even realize it. But when I drank, it allowed me to take myself out of me and to be okay with myself. So the inhibitions were gone, and I felt okay. And that was my journey. That was my journey into my sexuality. It was, you go out, you hook up with people, and you drink until, you just drink until you either pass out or you get sick, or or whatever. And I always hung out with people that partied just as much as I did, or did a little bit more. And as I kind of navigated through my early 20s, I started to hang out with people that like to quote unquote party. So back in the early 90s, just as the slides showed, um, ecstasy was becoming really big, and cocaine was still pretty big in the gay community. So I did cocaine for the very first time, and I remember that it made me feel much different than alcohol did. It took away my inhibitions. In my mind, I thought more clearly, and I had a lot of this euphoric energy, and I really liked the way it made me feel. And me being the addict and alcoholic that I am, I wanted more. I was always searching for something more, to take me out of me, to make me feel that I was okay and comfortable in my own skin. And doing that, I really didn't have a lot of inhibitions, and I just kind of, if an opportunity came up, let's party, let's have sex, whatever, I would do it. And I remember in 1991, I went to see my doctor, and I would get tested every 6 months or so, because they had the test then, and they could see, if you had HIV or not. It was a little bit more sophisticated, as opposed to the early 80s. And by the 90s, they realized that it wasn't just gay people; it was transmitted through through blood and sex and whatnot. Anyway, long story short, I ended up testing positive for HIV in February of 1991, and there weren't the medications that they had today. And back then, 3, 4 years maybe is what your life expectancy was. And that really took my addiction into a whole different direction than I ever even thought that it would go. I just didn't care enough about me to take care of me, and I was knee deep in my addiction. So the partying increased, and again, I was always looking for the next party. And I used to party in New Orleans, and I would go to Los Angeles. I'd go to like, whatever the big gay event was with the big party, I would go to it. And then probably around 1992 or 1993, and I did my partying in Washington. Cocaine kind of dried up in the city. A couple of the big dealers got busted, and I remember that nobody could find cocaine. And I ran into a really good friend of mine. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning in this club, and he said to me, he said, "Do you want to try something?" And I was the addict that, look, I'll try anything, smoke it, snort it, whatever, I'll do it. And he said to me, he goes, this drug has been around for a while. It's big on the West Coast, and it hasn't quite hit the East Coast yet. He said, "Do you want to try it?" I said, "Absolutely, let's try it." And it ended up being crystal meth. And I remember it was this club called Tracks. I was how glamorous, right? I'm in a bathroom stall with this guy, doing crystal meth. And I remember when it hit my system. First of all, it burned my nose, from my nose all the way up into my sinuses, and it drained to the back of my throat. And it was extremely painful. But when that methamphetamine hit my system, it took me to a place that I had never been before. And just like the good doctor said, it took me to a euphoric place where I felt I had zero inhibitions. I felt fantastic, and something in my head clicked and said, "This is what you have been searching for, and this is the only thing that you want to do." And that was a slow downward spiral really into insanity for me. And I made a few trips out to Los Angeles during that time, and meth was huge in California. It was big on the West Coast, but it hadn't quite hit the East Coast yet. So I started using, and it progressed to the point where I started injecting it. And that was the one thing I swore I would never do. I'll smoke it, I'll snort it, I'll never inject it. But again, I would always hang out with people that partied just a little bit more than I did. So in 1995, I injected crystal meth. I remember it was like April of 1995, and I injected it. And I remember when I did it, that I knew two things. Number one, that my addiction has gone into a direction that there's no turning back. and this is the only way that I ever want to do it. And that was this, that my entire life completely fell apart. My family was devastated. They knew that I was using. I was on the verge of losing my job, you know. And I remember like it was yesterday. I was all alone in a dark apartment in Frederick, Maryland. That's where I ended up on this particular night. And I was all alone sitting in this apartment. Nobody was around me with nothing but meth, needles, and a candle. That's where my life had become. And you know, I was on the, like I said, I was on the verge of losing my job, and actually found out that they were going to fire me. And I called into work the next day and begged for a second chance, which they graciously gave me a second chance. And I entered treatment 2 days later, and I ended up going to a little treatment center in Winchester, Virginia. They didn't have doctors and psychiatrists and nurses. It was a big recovery house, and it was all about 12-step meetings, getting a sponsor, you know, and working the steps. And you know, I detoxed off of meth there, and it was pretty brutal. And the detox off meth, you know, you're exhausted, you're tired, you feel like every nerve on the inside is on the outside, and you just feel like ripping people's heads off. And it took me like about a week or so to finally kind of get myself pulled together, you know. And then I started to like listening to what people had to say, going to meetings, and I got a sponsor. And I decided to give sobriety a try because I didn't want to go back to where I was before. And I had to really, not had to, I wanted to really relearn how to be a sober gay man, right? I had never looked at my sexuality. I had never looked at the core issues of being bullied and teased and picked on. Um, and I never looked at my HIV, all of these big things that I had never looked at before. And I knew that if I wanted to stay sober, I was going to have to look at all of those things. And so I started doing my work. I started my journey into recovery. And then at about 2 months sober, I had an amazing opportunity to come to Pennsylvania to come to an HIV retreat, which I'd never heard of, Karen. And I'd never even thought about an HIV retreat. My sponsor brought me in October in 1995 to Karen for this HIV retreat. And it was the first time that I was around other people just like me, right? Other people who were sober gay people who were HIV positive or actually had AIDS. There were some people who were in the last stages of AIDS. And it ended up being an amazing experience that really allowed me to get that little glimmer of hope that recovery from crystal meth was possible. So these retreats helped my early recovery, but my sponsor did something with me because he was familiar with stimulants and meth. And, you know, my sponsor really worked with me along with my therapist that I had to relearn how to have sober sex because sex on meth is like something I never experienced before. I had to relearn how to have sober sex. My first sponsor said to me, he goes, "You were never going to have sex the way you did on meth." And it was like it hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, people are not meant to have sex that way. That's not intimate sex with somebody you care about." So I had to relearn that. I had to rewire that part of my brain. And I also had to relearn how to have sober relationships with people in recovery. I had to learn how to have relationships with men and not thinking, you know, wow, this is somebody I want to sleep with, or do they want something from me? Because meth, as well as all of my addiction, had kind of skewed my thought process on how to have relationships. So that was my journey into early recovery, was relearning how to live life as a sober gay man. And you know, coming to those retreats and doing all of that work really allowed me to really start to come into my own. And you know, I won't get into the details of how it happened, but I ended up coming to these retreats, you know, 3 or 4 times a year for many years. And I became really good friends with some of the staff. And my career with my other job had really kind of taken off because if you show up for work and do what you're supposed to do, you actually can really be successful. I hadn't put those pieces of the puzzle together. So I had the opportunity to come and work at this place where I came to these retreats. Met an amazing man by the name of Father Bill, who's a legend at Karen, and he and I became very close. And he convinced me, and those that know Father Bill has a way of convincing people with a lot of pushing and pushing and pushing, and I did it. I made the decision to leave my big career that I had with my other profession and to come and work at Karen. And in 2004, I did it. I took an entry level position. I took a massive pay cut. And I started working here. And one of the gifts of working here, and I kind of became the resident meth, gay crystal meth addict expert at Karen. They knew how to treat people, but they had not really seen a lot of meth addicts. And this was in the early, 2004, 2005, where there was an uptick, especially in the gay community. Um, it should be noted that crystal meth is huge in the gay community, especially with gay men, and where it is today from when I rolled into treatment in 1995, it's actually it's sad and it's scary and it isn't getting better. So I've had the opportunity, in my 17 years at Karen to work with not only the clinical staff but also with meth addicts that come into treatment because they're scared. A lot of times they're coming in paranoid, and there's an interesting dynamic that I have seen that take place with meth addicts that continued meth use will take you to that paranoid place. And it's interesting that people's delusions are all a little different, but they're pretty much the same. People are out to get me. My phone is bugged. You're in on the plan to try to harm me. And people that do meth for long periods of time, when they hit that wall of paranoia, that they might stop for a period of time, when they pick up again, they go right to that place. All of the euphoria and the fun and whatnot goes away, and they go right to that paranoid place. And so, having the opportunity to work with these meth addicts coming into treatment has been an absolute blessing because I speak the language. I call it tweaker talk. It's it's a language unto itself. Just to have somebody that's been there, done that, and understand it really will help people. But you know. Um, Meth gave me all of these inhibitions and confidence in making me feel good. That was really, that really is like, it isn't the way people are really supposed to be because it's all false. It really is false. I had to relearn how to be confident, in who I am now without the meth. But, just to give some examples of where we are today in the world of meth. So I'm grateful that I got sober when I did in 1995 because cell phones were just getting started. My first cell phone was like a brick. You could have like hit somebody over the head with it and use it as a weapon. I mean, it was massive compared to cell phones of today. And technology is great. However, in the world of gay people, there are hookup dating apps they call them, right? So for example, Grinder is one, and you load the app on your phone, you put in a profile, and when you open the app, it shows you other gay men who are within 2 feet, 5 feet, 1 mile, 2 mile, 5 mile, and they have profiles. And I can safely say that probably 80% of the people on Grinder are partying and using meth. There's code words in, so if you go into somebody's profile and they say they party and there's a capital T, T is the code word for Tina, which is the code word for meth. So you will see party with the capital T, or you'll see P&P, which is party and play, meaning I like to party and I like to play, meaning I like to have sex. And the COVID has definitely taken meth use to a whole new level, and I've spent quite a bit of time with gay men who had long-term sobriety who relapsed during COVID because they were isolated, bored, and they got on the apps and ended up picking up again. And another interesting dynamic, and I'll wind this down, was that quite a few gay men that lived through the AIDS epidemic of the 80s were re-traumatized with COVID because when COVID first hit, there was a lot of unknown. There was a lot of misinformation, and the world kind of shut down and people were isolated, and it kicked up a lot of PTSD, created PTSD from people that had lived through the AIDS epidemic. It kicked up and made them almost kind of feel that it was kind of happening all over again, which in turn, they needed something to kind of take them away from that, and they picked up meth again. So we have definitely seen a resurgence of meth, and it's, just even with the numbers. And in Pennsylvania alone, I believe in the last couple of years, meth has passed the, opioids. That meth is, and it's easier to get, right? It's all coming out of Mexico. It's transported right up through the borders into the United States, and it's very, very potent and highly addictive. So, so that's kind of my journey. Again, I'm grateful I got sober when I did, and grateful that that we're talking about it more now. You know, even 5, 10 years ago, there was not a lot of discussion about meth and where it is today, but now it's kind of out on the forefront again. So, you know, I'm grateful to be part of the conversation and part of the solution. So, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kim, for having me.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, Greg Hobelman. I mean, to have the two of you both in recovery, using what you've learned and then turning into, I mean, you're such a gift, both of you, to the communities that you serve, to the field that you, thank goodness, have chosen to expend all that great energy and expertise. So thank you both so much. And Tom, especially, it is always so valuable to hear such a personal story, and full disclosure, you're my dear friend, and I thank you very much for that. So yeah, glad to have you here. So we have so many great questions. I mean, please, folks, feel free to submit any questions that you have during this talk. You know, put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A anytime now. So please go ahead and do that. But I will go ahead and start with some of the advanced questions. We actually had one come in just as Dr. Hobelman was speaking. So I'll start with this. For children with ADHD, does the use of Adderall or similar medications prescribed and monitored by a physician reduce or increase the chance that these children will eventually use illegal drugs?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So it's actually looking at it's risk benefit question. So what we know is that people that have ADHD that are untreated are at higher risk for developing a substance use disorder. We also know that people who are exposed to mind or mood altering substances at an earlier age have an increased risk of developing a substance use disorder. So in both cases, you end up with somebody having a risk factor. Now, if you have somebody with a severe case of ADHD, first thing to think about is how else can we treat it? That's always a good approach. You don't have to jump right to stimulants to treat ADHD. In very severe cases, it can be absolutely life-changing in a good, positive way. So there are cases where it's a very much indicated, and we would certainly recommend treating with a stimulant because it makes such a difference in that person's life. For other cases, though, look at other means of treatment. So there are a lot of cognitive behavioral approaches. You, of course, want to look at making sure that the child is getting good sleep. It plays a huge role in the treatment of ADHD. And then you can look at other medications. Guanfacine or Intuniv and Strattera are medications that could potentially be very beneficial. So you don't have to jump right to stimulants. But in those cases where the ADHD is not able to be treated well and has true beneficial effects, then it probably is better to treat with stimulants. But it's just being very careful and understanding that, yes, that does likely increase the risk of developing a substance use disorder just because the brain has been exposed to a mind or mood altering substance at an earlier age.
Thank you. Also, I noticed this as you were speaking as well. You mentioned that dealers cut their amphetamine with fentanyl to increase their users. And this person says, students always ask me why that is, since it might kill the user, thus decreasing the number of customers or users. Would you like to explain that, Dr. Hobelman?
Yeah, I mean, the amount of people that are using and not dying is vastly greater than the number of people that are using and dying. And typically dealers are more interested in getting repeat customers than they are with the outcome of that customer's life, or of course, because they're clearly selling something that's harmful to begin with, and they're not thinking in terms of people dying. But, if one person dies, they're going to get another 100, 200, 300 customers for that one death. So for them, to cut with fentanyl makes sense from a dealer standpoint. But yes, they are increasing risk of death.
Sure. And I've also heard it explained that when this is being done illicitly, it's obviously not in a controlled environment. So they might be mixing in some fentanyl with whatever the product is, whether it's heroin or methamphetamine. And just as, it's kind of a silly comparison, but like if you're making chocolate chip cookies and you put in the chocolate chips and you mix it, this cookie might have 3 chips, this one might have 6. So obviously it's not as controlled an environment. So one packet of heroin might or methamphetamine might contain a great deal more fentanyl than another one does. So it's sort of
Absolutely.
a bit of Russian roulette there, unfortunately.
And just when they're cutting it too, in terms of potency, the same thing happens.
Right, right. So are there any medications that can help curb stimulant cravings? I think that you addressed this in your speech or your presentation earlier. So I don't know that we need to go any deeper on that. So let's go to, here's one. As a volunteer mentor of at-risk youth, what should I be aware of that hasn't yet become common knowledge? So, we work with a lot of folks in the prevention world, and I think we have some of them with us here this evening. So any thoughts, actually from either of you, I guess, about what kind of messaging to give our young people so that they know the risks, so that we're finding the right language to use with a young person. I think, Dr. Hobelman, you mentioned you have young children yourself. Is there any kind of advice you can give folks to how to talk to about young people about the risks?
Yeah, in terms of sort of hidden trends, or I don't think there are many out there that we haven't spoken of. I don't know of any. I mean, I'm sure there are some things that are out there that we don't know of course, but there's nothing that comes to mind. In terms of talking about it, so and this is my own experience as well as working with families and so forth. I think exposing kids to discussions around substance abuse and substances in general at an earlier age is perfectly fine. It really is. Think about it like this. Kids don't have preconceived notions. The substances themselves aren't actually evil. It's what they end up doing to the user and so forth. But if you are able to talk and if you can make it personal in some way, so that you are relating a story of someone that you know or someone you care about, because that will destigmatize it. They don't have these preconceived notions, so they're not. And I'll tell you, in my own case, I got sober. My oldest daughter was 9, and 9 years old was at a point where it was really, they didn't really understand the concept of addiction, But I'll tell you, we use the term addiction all the time, right? People are addicted to TV, they're addicted to the screen, and so people are always saying that they're addicted to things, So by the time they're 10, 11 years old, they're starting to get an idea of what this term means. And so it was a very good time for me to talk to my daughter, and I explained to her, when I went away for 4 months that summer, I went away because I had an addiction, and this is what addiction means, and this is what happened with that. And again, you don't go into the gory details or whatever, and you describe it as what it is, which is an illness. People get better, just like with other illnesses. You can get better. In fact, you can get better than 100%, which is really nice. And so you start talking it in terms of the recovery, rather than focusing on the addiction. Of course, you can talk about what could potentially happen, but you focus on the recovery piece, and that really sends the full picture of what happens to people who have substance use disorders and then get well. And then they don't really have this, there's not nearly as much stigma. And the earlier we introduce it across the board, that's a really powerful way to begin to battle the stigma, at least with the youth. In terms of things that we know that are not really that effective, it is in terms of curbing their use. Just me telling my story to a group of kids really isn't a deterrent at all. It's very hard. So I mean, we of course have to look at, I think, larger public health campaigns that are ultimately going to really have the effect that we want. But of course, individually, we really sit down, we really listen, we really have individual talks, and at least begin to introduce the concepts.
Right. Thank you. And asking them some questions too, right? Why do you think people get high? Why do you think people choose to do this? And and listening thoughtfully, it can be really hard because we want to maybe, I know I certainly wanted to jump into a lecture when I heard some scary thoughts from my kids, but I think it's an important thing to give them an opportunity to express what they're thinking and what their perceptions are of why others.
And if you think about why people use substances, they generally, it's only a few reasons. They use because it feels good. They use to self-medicate in some way. They use to avoid withdrawal, but at that point, the cat's sort of out of the bag. And then finally, they use because of peer pressure. So having that discussion and talking directly about peer pressure, and because usually someone who's 12 or 13 is not reaching for a substance to change their mood. It hasn't become part of their general life. So they're introduced in some way, and often it's through a peer. So if you have the discussion of, hey, you know what, it's okay to say, I'm not interested right now, and find some way to directly address the fact that they are going to be peer pressured at some point to use a substance, and it's okay to say no. And of two, and my kids, my daughters, my son's too young now, but my daughter's one, hasn't had a drink yet. She's 19, and the other one has, she's 16. So, they're going to do what they're going to do, so to speak.
Right. And even I love that idea of, kind of talking through how to say no, in like to even role play and have them act it out. That's like that experiential learning, right?
Yeah.
Of playing it out. And I heard somebody recommend this not too long ago, of even suggesting to our kids that they work with a friend to role play if they feel a little uncomfortable doing it with mom and dad, to maybe spend some time with a really trusted friend. Like, how would we get out of this situation if we're at a party and somebody offers something, what to say?
Yeah, and to make it comfortable, add humor, and there are a lot of different techniques that you can avoid peer pressure without making it an awkward, I'm not the cool kid or something.
Right.
So I agree.
Like
The role
that.
play is great.
Yep. Someone's asking, what other drug options should I consider as a replacement for Adderall XR prescribed to a 10-year-old for ADHD?
Yeah, and the drug that I mentioned before, guanfacine, which is Intuniv, and Strattera, atomoxetine, are good drugs to try. Neither of those are mind or mood altering, and they have been shown to be beneficial for the treatment of ADHD. So I think it's worthwhile giving those a try. It may be difficult, sort of having gone to a stimulant, because they really don't have the same impact. They don't have the same onset. There's not an immediate, reward, so to speak, of the euphoria, which is across the board, even in kids. So the effects take longer, or takes longer to have effect, but they can be very, very good medications. So, and then besides the medications, there are a variety of cognitive behavioral techniques that can be utilized. So, try all of those things. Yeah. And potentially you can have someone come off with stimulants. It happens all the time. And we do that in treatment frequently. People come in that are on stimulants and have a substance use disorder, and they no longer want to be on stimulants, but they have a very clear diagnosis of ADHD. They can do very well on those medications. Thank
you. And speaking of medications for ADHD, the question is, should there be concern with FDA approval for ADHD drugs like Purdue Pharma's I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Adhancia? This drug was FDA approved for 6-year-olds, and up its extended release formula is prime for misuse. So
I think you always want to be aware of substances. This happens all the time in the pharmaceutical industry. We have a lot to be thankful for the pharmaceutical industry. They are producing drugs and they're finding new therapeutics, and a lot of good comes from that. But they're also out there to figure out how to make money. So when you look at Adhancia and you say, what is that? Well, it's methylphenidate. And so it's always helpful to look at what the generic name is, because a lot of generic names are repackaged as something else. And if there's a new formulation like an XR or XL version, they can get a patent for that, and then FDA approval. So methylphenidate is FDA approved. So very likely a new formulation will get approved, if it shows effectiveness for certain populations. But yes, I think that just checking medications no matter, what you're trying to treat, looking at the mechanism of action, understanding whether or not it's a mind or mood altering drug is an important thing to do. So yeah, be very aware, because more drugs are going to come out, more stimulants will come out with essentially amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, and methylphenidate in them.
Okay, and then another one for you, I think, would be, which stimulant seems to be the most widely misused by youth? And I suspect they're asking about whether it's prescribed or illicit, but which is most widely misused by youth.
Yeah, I don't absolutely know the answer, but anecdotally, it's Adderall, it's amphetamine. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was methylphenidate. And over the last decade, Adderall has really been misused. And when we see people coming into treatment, very rarely are they using methylphenidate anymore. And the vast majority are using amphetamine, Adderall.
Yeah, okay. And methylphenidate, that's Ritalin, is that right?
Right.
That's
Right. Yep.
Okay, got it. Okay. Are there treatment centers for those addicted to stimulants / Adderall only, or is there a drug that counteracts Adderall craving? We've already addressed the craving piece. There is no MAT for that, but I don't believe there are. Are there any treatment centers that just focus on stimulants?
I don't know of any. Tom, are you aware of any that focus? I mean, no, that focus solely on stimulants. I don't know of any.
Not that I'm aware of, no, but most treatment centers are able to manage that.
Yeah. And there are mutual self-help groups that are really, I mean, not only for stimulants, but there's for methamphetamine and for cocaine. And so, if you're looking for a particular population and you want to go into a group and be able to really identify quickly, then they're available, absolutely, but not in the treatment world per se.
Great point, though, about the 12-step programs. Yes, Cocaine Anonymous, and yeah, others for sure.
And Crystal Meth Anonymous as well, too.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I mean. You could take the stimulants and break them down. And I don't know if there's an amphetamine but I know there's crystal meth and there's cocaine. Yeah.
Right.
Anonymous.
There are over 120 different types of 12-step programs, and there's one for Adderall, or Yeah. How about someone's asking about the average percentage of rate of overdose from stimulants, and they're asking how serious meth has become. I think we've pretty much covered, the uptick in meth use, but overdose, because of course, and this is something that we've been talking a lot about just over the last few years. We've been so focused, rightly so, on opioid use disorder, and we know now that there are many treatments, MAT, there's Suboxone, Sublocade, Vivitrol, other things, methadone, but also, the detox is so different, and also the potential for fatality it seems to be much more immediate with opioids because of the respiratory suppression that happens when someone is overdosing on opioids. Can you talk about that a bit, Dr. Hoberman, like about what the risk for overdose is and how it is more cardiac, isn't that?
Yeah, it is much easier to overdose from an opioid than it is from a stimulant. And so when you look at overdose death, it is a very powerful indicator, that there's a problem, but that is an end stage problem. And really, I think you have to pay attention to everything that occurs before that. So when you're looking at individual burden to individuals, as well as societal burden and how it's affecting lives and destroying lives and so forth, it's really important to know it, because if you say, well, okay, there were only 17,000 deaths associated with stimulants, but there were 53,000 deaths associated with opioids, and you make the conclusion that opioids are causing more across the board problems, it's misrepresented. Because Tom, your story was incredibly powerful and describes what happens, and when we look at the effects of people's lives, from particularly with crystal meth, it's devastating. I mean, it's very hard to maintain a dependence on methamphetamine. You have actually a greater likelihood of maintaining some normalcy in your life if you are on opioids or on benzodiazepines or you're drinking. So all of the other harm associated with that substance, has to be considered when you're talking about the harms that occur. So the overdose death rate is not very indicative of that, and it is harder to die. And what you die from, as you noted, was cardiac effects, arrhythmias, hypertension, strokes, rhabdomyolysis, things like that.
Thank you. Someone has asked, can a person take methadone and a stimulant together? And I think that probably what they're driving at is methadone being a medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder. So if someone is receiving that kind of medication-assisted treatment for opioids, can they simultaneously use stimulants and get high?
So two parts to that, right? One is can they? Of course they can. So yes. Somebody using methadone very often is abusing stimulants. We see that quite frequently, and they might be doing very well with regard to their opioid use disorder, and then develop a stimulant use disorder on top of that. And often people come into treatment, will continue their methadone, and we'll treat them for their stimulant use disorder. So yes, they can use it. They can certainly get high from it and develop, a co-occurring substance use disorder. The other piece is that, and that you may interpret that question is can somebody who is involved in the methadone program be prescribed a stimulant for the treatment of ADHD? And that can occur as well, yes. Again, you really want to be very carefully selective. You want to have the discussion with that patient to let them know the risks, because there are risks associated with it. But if you have somebody who has an opioid use disorder and is on methadone and has a severe case of ADHD, then stimulants can be very effective treatment. And you do want to treat the ADHD. You don't want that ADHD to go untreated, because that is a risk for relapse back to using illicit opioids.
And I want to invite our attendees to, if you have any other questions, we have a few minutes left. Please feel free to submit your questions in the chat or Q&A. But I would like to ask you both to tell me what you think about the fact that, one of the things I think you described, Dr. Hobelman, was how there's not always as much motivation to seek recovery for those who are addicted to stimulants. And I'm just wondering, and especially for you, Tom, because you are on the front lines, particularly with this population, I know that so many times our participants are primarily family members who are hopefully trying to get someone to that contemplation stage and get them into treatment. Any thoughts about how to help someone get to a place almost like that pre-intervention, to help them get to a place that they're ready to make some changes? You talked about how, you had to make that decision to abstain, to completely change how you interacted with other gay men, even in every relationship, how you saw yourself. What a tremendous challenge that is to make that decision. And so any thoughts about how to use some motivational language with a loved one?
It's challenging to have conversations with somebody who's actively using meth, especially when they're high. They are spinning out of control, and especially if they're in the paranoid state, thinking that families have to get them. It's a bit of a challenge. But when given the opportunity, when I do work with families that they want to sit down and have a conversation, I always say come from a place of compassion, care, and love. Because even with all the crap they've done and the anger you might be having towards them, coming at them from a place of anger isn't going to work. They're not going to be, even in the heightened sense, they're not going to be able to hear it. But if you come from a place of, we care about you, we want to help you, this is what we're seeing, even if they're in that place of denial, sometimes you'll be able to get through to them if you come from, we're concerned and we care about you. If they aren't willing to hear it, I'm a big fan of getting professional help. Families might have best intentions to try to navigate a loved one into treatment, and sometimes it just doesn't work, and then you need to seek professionals that are able to work with family and then, set up the conversation to sit down to try to get them into treatment.
Dr. Hobelman, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Tom said. And then I do think that one thing we know is that if you create really an enriched, loving environment, it does promote recovery, and continuing to shame somebody, make them feel bad, is going to absolutely drive them to continued use. So I think, Tom hit the nail on the head with that one. And then there's that other piece too, which is, we use motivational interviewing, in terms of how we treat people, but it's something that I think comes very intuitive to people. And the idea is to ask questions, help them to overcome their ambivalence that this is a problem. So helping that by asking questions, you get them to realize, hey, things aren't going the way I hoped that they would go. They're not, proceeding the way that I wanted my life to be. And sometimes you can just help with that, pushing them in the direction. But I also agree with getting professional help, because it's very difficult to be validated, as a family member to that person who's suffering from a substance use disorder.
Thank you both. Yes, I can say that, my son, who thankfully has found long-term recovery, stimulants was his drug of choice. He had a lot of substances that he was using, but looking back, he said that was absolutely, amphetamines was where he was really, really the most having that addiction. And we did an intervention. I could not have done it on our own. We tried everything under the sun. We had so many fruitless conversations, and we really did need that professional help for us. We need, our son barely, I think, remembers the intervention, and certainly doesn't remember the interventionist who was in the room with us, but she changed our lives by helping us find the language and do the right things to get him that help. So stay connected with us. We have lots of resources that we can share with you, as well as, Tom and Dr. Hubelman and others. And on behalf of, I'll just say, Mallory Parati, thank you for hosting us tonight. And she did mention that their office has plenty of resources. I'm going to make sure to put the link to Bucks County Drug and Alcohol Commission, so that you know how to access them for treatment resources, as well as, again, all the information on Greg and Tom's phenomenal programs that they're a part of. So what an amazing evening. Thank you all so much for being with us. And thank you especially to Greg Hobelman and to Tom McDermott. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Mallory. And again, this was recorded, so you'll have an opportunity to share it. Please take the survey that comes up at the end, and that will also be on the follow-up page. I need to put that link on there. This recording will be available tomorrow morning. It takes a little while to process, so I'll get it up there by morning, so you can check that follow-up page. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
It's great to
Kim.
be here.
Appreciate it.